I'm a 32-year-old woman, and this story starts with the house I inherited from my grandmother. It's a beautiful 2-story suburban home in a great neighborhood, the kind of place with tree-lined streets, friendly neighbors, and plenty of charm. This house isn't just property, it's full of memories. My grandmother lived there for decades, and everything about it reminds me of her. It's in my name, completely paid off, and something I thought I'd never have to worry about until my mother-in-law moved in. I married Jason, my husband, 2 years ago after dating for 3 years. He's 34, and we've always had a good relationship, at least we did at first. Jason's close to his mom, Diana. She's 57, a widow, and the kind of woman who always has to have the last word. Diana's the type who insists she's just trying to help while steamrolling over everyone else's opinions. Jason always brushed it off, saying, "That's just how she is," which I didn't love but tolerated because, back then, it wasn't my problem. Things changed about a year ago. Diana's landlord raised her rent, and she couldn't afford to stay in her apartment. Jason suggested she move in with us temporarily until she found something more affordable. I was hesitant. I mean, it's one thing to have your mother-in-law over for dinner, it's another to share your entire living space. But I agreed under clear conditions: no redecorating, no changing house rules, and she'd have 6 months to find a new place. Jason promised it'd be fine. Spoiler, it wasn't. Diana moved in with her usual energy, which meant she was unpacking and criticizing at the same time. She walked around the house, pointing out everything she thought could be improved. She barely set down her suitcases before deciding the kitchen needed a woman's touch. A week later, I came home from work to find she'd repainted the cabinets a color I hated without asking me. When I confronted her, she waved it off, saying, "Oh, you'll love it once you get used to it." That was just the beginning. Diana started hosting dinner parties for her friends, turning our living room into her social hub. She rearranged furniture to open up the space, and even moved my grandmother's antique armchair, a family heirloom, to the basement. When I asked why, she said it didn't match her aesthetic. Jason told me to let it go, claiming it wasn't worth fighting over. "She's just trying to feel at home," he said. But it wasn't her home. It was mine. The final straw came when I overheard Diana talking to Jason in the kitchen late one night. She was telling him that the house should be their home, and that it wasn't fair I had sole ownership. She even suggested we rethink the deed to include Jason's name. When I confronted Jason about it, he brushed it off as a misunderstanding. He said she didn't mean it that way, but I wasn't so sure. Diana, however, didn't bother hiding her intentions anymore. She started referring to the house as our home whenever she spoke to Jason or her friends. She even told one of our neighbors that I was just a guest. The neighbor mentioned it to me later, saying, "I didn't realize you were renting the place." I was livid. When Diana wasn't busy trying to claim ownership, she was gaslighting me. If I pushed back on her behavior, she'd call me selfish or accuse me of not being a team player. She began pressuring me to add Jason to the deed, saying a husband deserves to share the home. Every time I said no, she'd make snide remarks about how I didn't trust my own husband. Jason, of course, avoided taking sides. He'd tell me he didn't care about being on the deed, but that I should consider it to keep the peace. The tension escalated when Diana started enforcing her own house rules, as if she were the one in charge. She dictated when the thermostat could be adjusted and what time lights should be out at night. She even threw out some of my personal items, claiming they were cluttering up the space. Every time I tried to set boundaries, she'd find a way to bulldoze right through them. The breaking point came during yet another late-night whisper session between Diana and Jason. This time, I didn't stay silent. I walked into the kitchen, and before I could even say a word, Diana turned to me and said, "You're the one who doesn't belong here." That's when I knew things were about to change. Update 1. The moment Diana told me I didn't belong in my own home, I knew things were about to escalate. And boy, did they. It started subtly at first, almost as if she wanted to test how far she could push me. Whenever family came over for dinner, she'd introduce me as the guest, smiling sweetly as if it were a joke. I tried to laugh it off the first time, but when it happened again and again, it became clear this was no joke. At one of these gatherings, Diana's sister commented on how nice it was that Diana had opened her home to Jason and me. I corrected her, explaining that the house was mine, and Diana interjected with a chuckle, saying, "Oh, we all know how much Jason has invested in making this place a home." I could feel my jaw tighten, but Jason sat there, staring at his plate. He didn't say a word. Later, when I asked him why, he shrugged, saying it wasn't worth the fight. Things started to get weirder. One evening, I came home from work to find the lock on the master bedroom door had been changed. I couldn't believe it. Diana had hired a locksmith without my permission. She explained it as a safety precaution, claiming it was for Jason and me to protect our privacy. Except she'd kept a key for herself. I had to get a locksmith to change it back the next day. At that point, I decided to consult a lawyer. I wanted to be sure my ownership of the house was airtight. Thankfully, it was. The lawyer also recommended I keep records of everything happening, just in case. So I started documenting every strange incident, every boundary crossed, every interaction that felt off. Diana didn't know I was keeping track, but she made it easy. I started noticing her snooping through my personal documents. Once I caught her in my home office with papers scattered across the desk. She claimed she was organizing but looked far too interested in a stack of bank statements. When I locked the office door after that, she complained I was paranoid. The atmosphere in the house became unbearable. Diana began referring to the house as a prison and blamed me for it. She told Jason she couldn't understand how he could live like this, and he started spending more time out of the house to avoid conflict. I felt like I was living with a hostile roommate who wanted to overthrow me. A friend suggested I document her actions more thoroughly and advised me to stand my ground. She even lent me a few books on setting boundaries, but those boundaries only seemed to provoke Diana further. She started enforcing her own set of house rules, complete with quiet hours after 9 p.m. and limits on how often I could invite friends over. If I pushed back, she'd frame herself as the victim, saying she just wanted peace in her own home. But the worst was when she began her so-called cleaning sprees. She'd go through my things and throw out anything she deemed unnecessary. I lost personal items, some with sentimental value, and her excuse was always the same: I was just tidying up. You'll thank me later. Jason, of course, stayed neutral, claiming he didn't want to take sides. Then came the neighborhood gossip. Diana told anyone who would listen that I'd somehow stolen the house from Jason, spinning this wild tale about how he deserved half. One neighbor even approached me at the grocery store to ask if everything was okay because Diana had been talking about the situation. The final straw came when Diana invited a real estate agent to the house without telling me. I came home to find them walking through the living room, discussing potential upgrades. When I asked what was going on, Diana casually mentioned she was exploring options just in case we decide to sell. I was stunned. That night, I confronted Jason. I asked him outright where his loyalties were. He admitted he was conflicted. He said he wanted to make everyone happy but didn't know how. That was the moment I realized I was on my own in this. If I wanted to reclaim my home and my sanity, I'd have to take matters into my own hands. The next day, I had a heated argument with Diana. I accused her of trying to undermine my authority in my own home. She didn't deny it. Instead, she leaned in and delivered her final blow. If you don't like it, maybe you should leave. That's when everything clicked. This wasn't just about a controlling mother-in-law or a passive husband. This was a takeover. And if Diana thought she could bully me out of my own house, she was in for a rude awakening. I decided then and there that the situation couldn't go on like this. It was time to take control, and I had a plan. Update 2. After Diana's audacious claim that I should leave my own house, I realized I needed evidence to protect myself. It wasn't enough to document things on paper anymore. I had to catch her actions on camera. I installed discreet security cameras in common areas like the kitchen and living room. I didn't tell anyone, not even Jason. Within days, the cameras caught Diana going through my belongings again, this time rifling through my mail. She didn't even try to be subtle. She'd plop herself on the couch, open my envelopes, and skim through them, like she had every right. One clip showed her complaining to a friend on the phone, saying she was tired of waiting for Jason to get what's rightfully his. The footage was clear, undeniable proof of her intentions. Things took a turn when I stumbled upon something I hadn't expected. While organizing files in our shared office, I found a series of bank statements. At first, I didn't think much of them, but as I scanned the details, I noticed Jason had been sending money to Diana regularly, large amounts. I cross-checked the dates and realized this had been happening since she moved in. He'd never mentioned this, and it explained why our joint savings account wasn't growing as quickly as I'd expected. Before I could confront Jason, Diana decided to up the ante. One evening, after a particularly heated exchange, I went to our bedroom only to find the door locked. I hadn't locked it, and my key didn't work. Diana had changed the lock, again. This time, though, she made it clear that I wasn't welcome in my own room. I had to sleep in the guest room that night, feeling like a stranger in my own house. The next morning, I called my lawyer. He reviewed everything: my ownership of the house, the camera footage, and the financial statements. His advice was blunt. I had every legal right to evict Diana, but he suggested selling the house as the cleanest way to end the chaos. It wasn't what I wanted to hear, but I couldn't deny it made sense. Armed with this advice, I decided to call a family meeting. I needed to set boundaries once and for all. Jason and Diana sat across from me in the living room. I laid out everything: the footage, the financial records, and the repeated boundary violations. I made it clear that this was my house, and their behavior was unacceptable. Diana didn't take it well. She burst into tears, accusing me of trying to destroy her family. Jason, instead of supporting me, sided with her. He said I was being too harsh and that I needed to compromise for the sake of peace. That's when I gave Jason an ultimatum: he could stand by me, or he could move out with his mother. I made it clear that I wasn't going to tolerate this any longer. He looked conflicted but didn't give me an answer right away. Diana, however, took my ultimatum as a challenge. The very next day, I came home to find her redecorating the living room. She had dragged in furniture I'd never seen before, replaced my grandmother's antique coffee table, and hung new curtains. It was as if she were trying to erase any trace of me from my own home. Frustrated, I confided in a few close friends. They'd been following the drama from the sidelines and were unanimously supportive of the idea of selling the house. "You can't live like this," one of them told me. "Get out while you can." The tipping point came when Jason told me he was disappointed in how I was handling things. He said I wasn't being fair to his mother and accused me of putting him in an impossible position. After that conversation, both Jason and Diana started giving me the silent treatment. They acted as if I didn't exist, communicating with each other and ignoring me entirely. It was surreal. At this point, I knew I had to act quickly. I met with a real estate agent in secret, explaining my situation. The agent was sympathetic and assured me she could find a buyer fast. Within days, she came back with an all-cash offer that was too good to pass up. The thought of selling the house broke my heart. It was my grandmother's, after all, but I knew it was the only way to regain control of my life. I started packing my things quietly, room by room, making sure Diana and Jason wouldn't notice. Every box I taped shut felt like a small victory. When I looked at the cash offer again, I realized it wasn't just money, it was freedom. The paperwork was finalized and the deal was set to close. All that was left was to tell Jason and Diana. I rehearsed what I was going to say, knowing this bombshell would change everything. I wasn't just reclaiming my house, I was reclaiming my life. Update 3. I finalized the sale of the house without breathing a word to Jason or Diana. Everything had been carefully planned, and the paperwork was officially signed. The new owners were scheduled to do a walkthrough in a few days. My next step was securing a new apartment. I found a cozy one-bedroom in a nice neighborhood, far enough away to give me the fresh start I desperately needed. Packing was a delicate operation. I worked at odd hours, making sure Jason and Diana wouldn't notice. I rented a small storage unit to stash boxes gradually so there wouldn't be a pile accumulating in plain sight. Every time I loaded up my car with another batch of belongings, I felt like I was one step closer to reclaiming my life. The day of the walkthrough came faster than I expected. Diana was in the kitchen, talking loudly on the phone, when the new owners rang the doorbell. I let them in and started showing them around, acting as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Diana wandered into the living room mid-conversation, still holding her coffee. She froze when she saw strangers standing there, asking questions about the house. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her voice sharp. I calmly explained that I'd sold the house and the new owners were here for a final look before closing. The color drained from her face as she sputtered out something about it being impossible. Jason came in at that moment, looking confused. When he realized what was happening, his confusion turned to anger. He pulled me aside, demanding an explanation. I told him the truth. The house was mine, I had every right to sell it, and I was done with the chaos. Jason exploded, accusing me of betraying him and blindsiding him. He insisted that I'd ruined everything and acted selfishly. Diana, meanwhile, was pacing the living room, alternating between yelling at me and pleading with the new owners to reconsider. They politely ignored her and continued their walkthrough. After they left, Jason demanded to know where we were supposed to go. That's when I reminded him that the house had always been mine, and they'd been living there at my generosity. Diana's entitlement had crossed too many lines, and I was no longer willing to put up with it. He stood there in disbelief while Diana stormed off, slamming the door behind her. The reality of the situation hit them both hard over the next few days. Diana tried to reach out to extended family members, but her reputation preceded her. Years of burning bridges and manipulating people had left her with no one willing to take her in. Jason, for all his anger, seemed to realize there was nothing he could do. He spent his days calling friends, looking for somewhere to stay. The neighbors caught wind of the drama quickly. Diana had told so many people that the house was hers that the truth spread like wildfire. One neighbor even stopped me while I was loading my car, shaking her head and saying, "I don't know how you put up with her for so long." Apparently, Diana had been bad-mouthing me for months, and people were finally seeing through her lies. Jason eventually found a friend willing to let him crash on their couch. He begged me to let him and Diana move into my new apartment. He argued that I was abandoning him and leaving his mother homeless. I told him firmly that I needed space and independence, and they were not welcome in my new life. He left that conversation furious but powerless. A few days after I moved into my apartment, Diana showed up at the building. She pounded on my door, demanding to be let in. I didn't open it. She screamed outside for what felt like an eternity, drawing the attention of neighbors, before finally leaving. I immediately called my lawyer, who advised me to file for a restraining order if Diana tried to harass me again. Jason's choice became clear after that. He moved in with his friend and left Diana to fend for herself. She ended up in a cheap motel, calling family members to beg for help. Word got back to me through mutual acquaintances that she was blaming me for everything, but no one was buying her story anymore. Her downfall was entirely of her own making. For the first time in what felt like forever, I began to enjoy peace in my new space. The silence was refreshing, and the absence of constant tension was a relief. I focused on work, reconnected with friends, and even started decorating my apartment, a space that truly felt like mine. One night, as I sat on my balcony sipping coffee, I received a message from Jason. He apologized for everything, saying he wanted a second chance and promising he'd change. I stared at the message for a long time before deciding what to do. Update 4. Not long after Jason's message asking for a second chance, he started what I can only describe as an apology tour. He called me repeatedly, left voicemails, and even showed up at my apartment building. When I finally agreed to meet him at a coffee shop, on neutral ground, he tried to convince me that he had cut ties with Diana. He claimed she was out of his life for good and that he wanted to work on our marriage. But something about his story didn't add up. For someone who had supposedly cut ties, he still seemed far too defensive about her. He brushed off her behavior as the result of stress and bad circumstances while insisting she just needed help. I told him I needed proof of this so-called clean break before I could even consider hearing him out further. Meanwhile, Diana wasn't lying low. She began spreading lies about me to extended family. Through mutual acquaintances, I found out she was telling people I'd stolen the house from Jason, manipulated him, and left them both homeless out of spite. A few relatives even reached out to me directly, parroting her accusations. Luckily, I was prepared. I sent them the camera footage, bank statements, and a timeline of everything that had happened. It didn't take long for most of them to realize Diana's version of events didn't hold water. Diana's antics didn't stop there. She decided to escalate things by filing a lawsuit against me for emotional damages. I received the paperwork in the mail, and though it caught me off guard, my lawyer quickly assured me the case was baseless. We filed a response, and the court dismissed her claim almost immediately. Still, it was another exhausting hurdle in a saga that seemed never ending. Jason's true colors emerged not long after. Despite his earlier claims of cutting ties, he admitted during another conversation that he missed his mother and wanted to reconcile with her. He framed it as him being caught between two people he cared about, but to me it was clear he would never choose me over her. That realization was all I needed to make my final decision. I told Jason our marriage was over. I couldn't keep fighting a battle where my partner wasn't even on my side. He didn't argue, just sat there quietly, almost as if he'd been expecting it. I filed for divorce the next day, and with that, I closed the chapter on Jason and Diana for good, or so I thought. Diana's life took a steep decline after that. With no family willing to take her in and no steady source of income, she eventually ended up in a shelter. A mutual acquaintance told me she was still blaming me for her situation, but I didn't care anymore. I'd cut off all communication with her and Jason and was focused on moving forward. To truly start fresh, I decided to move to a new city. I found a great job opportunity in a vibrant area and packed up what little I had left to begin the next chapter of my life. The move was cathartic. I left behind the ghosts of my old life and embraced the idea of starting over. But Diana wasn't quite done. A few weeks after my move, I received a letter forwarded from my old address. It was from Diana. In it, she blamed me for everything. Her homelessness, her strained family relationships, even Jason's struggles. She wrote pages about how I'd ruined her life and destroyed her son's happiness. I didn't even finish reading it. I shredded the letter and tossed it in the trash. It was the last time I let her words take up any space in my life. Surprisingly, support came from an unexpected place, my old neighborhood. A few neighbors reached out after hearing about the drama, expressing their sympathy and even admiration for how I'd handled the situation. One neighbor mentioned how they'd always suspected Diana wasn't as innocent as she pretended to be. Their kind words reminded me that not everyone believed the lies she spread. Jason tried to reconnect a few more times. He sent texts asking to meet up, talking about how he missed me and still loved me. I ignored every message and eventually blocked him. There was no point in reopening old wounds. My life was better without the chaos he and Diana brought with them. Now, I'm in a place where I've truly moved on. My new job is going well, and I've made some wonderful friends in my new city. I've learned the value of setting boundaries and standing up for myself, even when it's uncomfortable. Most importantly, I've found peace. A kind of peace I didn't think was possible during the height of all the drama. Looking back, it's hard to believe how much has changed. What started as a nightmare turned into an opportunity to rebuild my life from the ground up. I'm finally free of the toxic influence of Diana and Jason, and I couldn't be more grateful for the fresh start. And as for Jason and Diana, well, their fate is no longer my concern. Update 5. A few months after I had finally settled into my new city, Diana reappeared in the most modern way possible, through a Facebook smear campaign. She created a public group titled something like Exposing My Name, the woman who destroyed our lives. Mutual acquaintances tipped me off to it, and the page was filled with wild, fabricated stories about how I had forced her and Jason out of their home, stolen everything they had, and left them homeless. I didn't engage with the group. Instead, I let her own lies work against her. It didn't take long for the comment section to blow up with people calling her out. Neighbors from my old community, extended family members, and even some of Jason's friends shared their experiences with Diana's manipulative behavior. One person posted a story about how Diana had tried to guilt trip them into loaning her money years ago. Another neighbor shared how Diana had told them the house was hers, even though everyone knew it wasn't true. Her attempts to garner sympathy backfired spectacularly. While Diana spiraled online, Jason's life wasn't faring much better. Word got back to me through mutual acquaintances that even his closest friends were distancing themselves from him. They didn't want to be dragged into his mother's drama, and many of them were tired of how he always seemed to take her side. Jason was becoming more isolated, and Diana's growing desperation only made things worse. In one last-ditch effort, Diana actually contacted the new homeowners of my old house. She claimed she'd been wrongfully evicted and asked if they could help her. They told her politely but firmly to leave them alone, then blocked her number. When I heard about it, I couldn't help but laugh at the audacity. But Diana wasn't done causing trouble. One morning at work, I was in the middle of a meeting when the receptionist called me to say someone was asking for me in the lobby. When I went down, there was Diana, standing there like she owned the place. She launched into a tirade, accusing me of ruining her life and demanding that I fix the mess I'd made. Security quickly intervened and escorted her out, but the scene she caused was humiliating. I filed a formal complaint with my workplace and decided it was time to take legal action. That afternoon, I called my lawyer and began the process of filing a restraining order against Diana. The paperwork was straightforward, and the evidence I had, from her Facebook posts to her workplace outburst, made my case strong. Once the order was in place, Diana was legally barred from contacting me or coming near my new apartment or workplace. As if things couldn't get worse for them, I later learned that Jason had lost his job. He'd been struggling to hold it together for months, and the stress of his situation had finally caught up with him. With no income and no friends willing to take him in, he moved back in with Diana at the cheap motel where she'd been staying. Diana then tried to milk her circumstances for sympathy by spreading news of a minor health scare. She claimed the stress I caused had led to her condition, but nobody bought it. Extended family and acquaintances were tired of her antics and mostly ignored her attempts to play the victim. Her next move was almost comical. Diana set up a crowdfunding campaign with a long, dramatic post about how she and Jason had been wrongfully displaced and needed help to get back on their feet. The campaign barely gained any traction. In fact, the comments section filled up with people exposing her lies and recounting her history of manipulative behavior. The campaign was quietly taken down a week later. While Diana and Jason floundered, my life continued to improve. I got a promotion at work, which not only came with a pay raise but also new responsibilities that I genuinely enjoyed. I focused on building new friendships and decorating my apartment, which now felt like a true sanctuary. Jason, however, wasn't ready to give up. One evening, he showed up at my apartment building, begging for reconciliation. He pleaded with me to give him another chance, insisting he'd changed. I stayed calm and reminded him that our divorce was final. I told him I had no intention of reopening that chapter of my life. He left looking defeated, and I blocked him from all contact shortly after. Diana's last move came in the form of a letter sent through a mutual acquaintance. In it, she promised to leave me alone forever if I provided her with financial help. I didn't even bother to respond. The letter went straight into the shredder. Not long after, I heard through the grapevine that Diana and Jason had been evicted from their motel for non-payment. With no family left willing to help them, their options were running out. I didn't ask for more details. I was done keeping tabs on their lives. One evening, as I sat on my balcony sipping coffee, I realized I felt nothing but relief. For the first time in years, there was no drama, no chaos, and no toxic people trying to drag me down. I was free to focus on my career, my friendships, and the bright future ahead of me. The chapter with Diana and Jason was closed for good.